all of you for being here today on this auspicious occasion. I'm especially gratified by all of our out-of-town guests, and some of you came from afar to celebrate this great moment for your kinsman, and it's just wonderful that you're here bonding together, some of you actually for the first time, and merging again with the James and Cromwell families. You're definitely more than kissing cousins. You know, you've, through the years, because of this old relationship, have formed a bond that I hope continues. When I got involved in launching this literary landmark program some years ago in Oklahoma, it was exciting to work with people from Washington, from the Library of Congress, from the American Library Association, and to see what we could do to salute the many, many wonderful writers that have either lived in the state or written about it or in some way touched this state.
And they honor those people by creating places where other people can go and visit and see different artifacts about their lives. And so every state has the opportunity to be part of that. And we're very fortunate in Oklahoma. We have the third most national literary landmarks in the nation. We're second only to New York and Florida, and we're very quickly catching up to both New York and Florida. And so I'm very excited about the prospect of actually taking both of them on.
The sites include the homes of Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner, and not all of them are built architecture. There's Willa Cather's Broad Prairie up in Nebraska. There's even a literary landmark for Grip. You all know who Grip was? Grip was the raven, formerly the pet of Charles Dickens, and the inspiration to none other than Edgar Allan Poe. Currently, as of this day, there are 140 national literary landmark sites across the country. The Friends of Libraries in Oklahoma, Folio, that you've heard about, has proudly invested in the development of this program since that beginning back in 2001. So today's dedication marks Oklahoma's 12th author to be so honored. Others are, I believe, listed in your program, and it's a prestigious bunch, including Will Rogers and Lynn Riggs and Sequoia and Ralph Ellison, and on and on. But today, we're here for one man, one person, one writer only. Marquis James, the man of the hour, the man of the day, and that's who we're here to honor. This graduate of Enid High School, class of 1911. And to help us kick off, really, this whole celebration, we're going to turn to a gentleman who has devoted a good part of his life to the study of this esteemed author, and that's Paul Vickery, Dr. Paul Vickery, a professor of history at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa and a noted Chautauqua scholar. Educating others, and that became clear at a beautiful luncheon we had today, educating others is one of Dr. Vickery's delights, and it's a well-chosen profession for him. He obviously has a passion for his subject. So from teaching in the classroom to writing books, he has himself become an accomplished author. And in addition to many, many journal and professional articles, he's also authored 3 books. His research of Marquis James included a trip to the Library of Congress back in the nation's capital to review that extensive collection of James' papers. His research has led him to publications and the development and presentation of the character of Marquis James. So now it's only fitting that we invite this spirit of Marquis James to the podium. It's my pleasure, it's my honor to present Dr. Paul Vickery as Marquis James.
Thank you for that fine introduction. And I have to say, it's good to be home. Good to be back here in Enid among so many family and friends. And I feel sometimes that I'm like a fish out of water up there in New York, but I miss the home here in Enid most of all. Normally, when I speak to groups such as this, I am always asked a few questions. Why did I become a writer? How do I choose the subjects that I write about? And how do I do my research? So I'd like to talk about that a little bit today. I have to remind you that I am a writer and not a speaker. And in fact, I really do not like to go to those literary teas where people sit around and drink tea with their little pinkies up. And so I am not a professional speaker. And so if I look at my notes occasionally, you'll understand that I'm a better writer than I am speaker. Now, why did I become a writer? You know, I have always loved words. I love the power that words can convey. When I was very young, my mother, Rachel Marquis, taught me how to read. By the age of 4, I was able to read. And we had a large library, particularly for that period of time, out here on a raw claim, a raw homestead claim that my father had obtained from the land run. And we had a library, and I was fascinated with books. I was fascinated with the written word. As I said, by the time I was 4, I was devouring books. And what kind of books? What boy would not thrill to the adventures of Alexander the Great as he conquered the world? What boy would not be excited in seeing how Caesar conquered Gaul and crossed into what is today England? What young man would not be thrilled with seeing and hearing and reading about the stories of Napoleon and his conquest of Europe? These are the stories that I love. These are the stories that my mother taught me to love. By the time I was 10, I could pass a normal school history test. I was that good in history. Now, other subjects, not so much. I'm still confused by the 8 parts of speech. And if I add up a column of numbers, if I get the same answer twice, it's probably by accident. So I read and I expanded my world. Words and books can take you places that you can never go on your own. They transpose you and translate you into other times, other countries, other habits and ways. We also had a Scribner's magazine, and my mother loved to show me civilized boys. They would be boys that sat around in a living room that had a fireplace and a piano. Ours, of course, did not. And my mother used to tell me stories of one particular boy, and she showed me his picture. And in that picture, he was pulling a barge. And Mama said that he was a good boy. He always obeyed his mother. And he worked hard, and he grew up to be president of the United States. And his name was James Garfield. And my father had a lot to do with getting this county named after Garfield. Well, at the time, I was disappointed because we didn't have any canals. We didn't have any boats that I could pull. We didn't have any of those kinds of things that I could do, so that's why I didn't grow up to be president, I guess. Another thing you may not know by looking at me now is that I used to have long, flowing, blonde, curly hair. My mother would tuck it up under my hat when I went out to play. And sometimes I would get the other boys would make fun of me. They would call me bad names. And probably the worst name that they could have called me was a girl. Well, I told them, I says, think about George Custer. Think about Temple Houston. Think about all of these other individuals that had long hair. Nobody would call Buffalo Bill, nobody would call them a girl, would they? Well, I can remember that our hired hand, Ad Polk, who lived there and was partly my tutor when my mother wasn't there, one day we went out to the barn, and he took a pair of scissors and he cut my hair off. And he gave it to my mother, who kept it in a box where she keeps all of those other things that are treasures of my childhood. Ad went in and he bought a box of chocolates. And he went in, he only gave me one of them. I can tell I'm back in Oklahoma, the flies are everywhere. And he gave my mother that box of chocolates, and he said to her, Ms. Rachel, I think I'd better be going for a couple of days. And she said, yeah, Ad, I think you'd better. Well, you know, my world was populated by lawyers. My father was a lawyer, and the criminals, the outlaws that he defended, and it was fringed with saloon keepers, Indians, outlaws, Mexicans, stagecoach drivers, and other individuals, tramp printers that came into the area. What boy would not be inspired by this? Well, when I was 10, we moved to Enid, downtown here, to be closer to school. And this was because my father always brought me to school, so I was always late. And I would come in, and Miss Edna would say to me, Marquis, just take your seat and get going on with the lesson. Well, Miss Edna was a saint and a real blessing. One day, how she punished students was one of two ways. She would either stand them in the corner, or she would give them a switching. And the girls, she never switched. But boys, she did. And I remember one time, Buck Wakeman, big Buck Wakeman, she broke 2 switches on him. Now, the littler boys, they would cry. But I determined once that when she caught me in a misdemeanor, that I would not cry. And I stood up there strong. And what I thought about was those Spartans. You remember the story of those Spartans who was standing at attention, and one of them had a squirrel tucked inside of his shirt. And that squirrel, he stood there so rigidly because he was not supposed to have done that. And the squirrel started eating his stomach and into his guts, but he didn't move. That was what I was thinking about when I was getting my switching for Miss Edna. So I determined that I was not going to cry. And I didn't. Later on, the big boys came to me and said, boy, Marquis, that must have hurt some. And I said, nah, didn't hurt a bit. Nah, it was fine. And then I heard a couple of girls saying, and I'm sure they were talking about me, boy, he sure is brave. What a guy he was. And so I picked my chest up, and that sort of began changing my interest in the opposite sex. I started to get an idea that they were different somehow, and that it was a good difference. Well, Ad Polk was, as I said, he taught me how to shoot. He and an old buffalo hunter, Mr. Howell, taught me how to shoot and how to read the signs, how to track in the wilderness. And Ad Polk is one of the most famous individuals in Enid history because it was he who shot and captured the illustrious Zip Wyatt, or as he is known here in Enid, what is his name here in Enid? Dick Yeager, yes, Dick Yeager, but he's also known as Zip Wyatt. Now, Dick Yeager was a ne'er-do-well, and Ad had heard that he was hiding up in the Glass Mountains. And so he went up there, and they surrounded the area, and he shot him with his gun. And he came upon him, and he said, "Stand up, you rascal. Dick, you're caught." And he said, "I can't get up. I can't raise my hands because my arms are broken." Well, I met Dick Yeager in the cell. He was in the prison cell, and my mama didn't like it very much, but I went to see him. And he was sitting on the bed there because he couldn't move. And he said, "Come here, boy." I walked over to him, and he held out his hand, and he shook my hand. And he said, "Now when you grow up, you can tell everybody that you shook hands with the biggest outlaw that Oklahoma's ever had." These were the kinds of stories that I wanted to write about. These were the kind of men that I looked up to, men of action, men who did things, men who accomplished great things in their lives. And so I began to expand my schooling. As I said, I was not very good at any other classes, so I guess you could say that I got into writing because I couldn't do anything else, and I knew a lot of stories. So that was how I got involved in writing in the first place. Well, as I said, when I was 10, we moved into downtown Enid, so I could be closer to school. And now a whole new world opened up to me because I was sent to the Enid High School, which was one of the largest buildings at the time, except it was only used for educational pursuits on the second floor. The bottom floor was where they practiced the opera. And on a boring Latin lesson, if you put your head on your desk and covered your ears, you could actually hear them practicing and singing there. And this was what I did because it improved the concentration powers wonderfully. Well, now, as to the question of how I got involved with writing and how did I choose my subject, I've always been not only fascinated with words, but also how words were printed, the printed page. Thank you, I loved the printed page, and I loved the way that books and newspapers were written. One of the most interesting groups of people that I would meet here in town were what we call tramp printers. Now, these boys would come into town, and they knew how to set type and would always be sort of transitory. They were always here just for a little while, and then they would move on. Most of them were addicted to the bottle, but I learned from them how to set type, how a newspaper was actually formed, and it was very interesting. I learned to say words. I learned what hellbox and bastard type. And these kinds of words were so exciting just even to say them. You know, I just loved how they sounded when you said those words. I began then working at one of the local newspapers. And at 14, I was a full-fledged reporter. And I would go around town and I would look into what was happening, and I would write those stories down as a reporter and would get them printed in the paper. one of the reasons that I really loved the printed word is because the printed word is there and you can see it. It's concrete. It doesn't come back on you. It doesn't try to fool you. Like at once the editor sent me out to look for a left-handed wrench. And I went all over the town looking and asking about a left-handed wrench until somebody told me that I was being put upon. A left-handed wrench, a type and print will pull these kinds of tricks on you. And it will be exactly what it says it will be. In Enid High School, as many of you know, and I'm sure the students know, that I and several others formed the yearbook, which we called the Quill, and it was that part of my contribution, as well as the cheer, to the high school. During the time I was in high school, again, I didn't master too many subjects. One of the subjects that I particularly did not like was they tried to teach you how to become a gentleman, how to dance, and how to have etiquette, and how to greet ladies, and to ask them to dance. Well, I never did learn that, and so really English and writing and history were the only subjects that I did well in, and I was lucky to graduate when I did at age 19. It was when I was 16, by the way, my father died, and I realized that I was going to have to help my mother by earning a living. And so I became really a full-time reporter at the age of 16. And so I went to high school, and I worked at the Enid, the Eagle, and the other newspapers in the area. And I graduated, as was mentioned, in 1911, and I then became a full-fledged reporter. I went from New Orleans to New York to Chicago, covering that triangle pretty well, writing about stories and trying to make a living. World War I came, and while I was in the, by the way, I joined the Army National Guard when I was 18, and I was the youngest National Guardsman in Oklahoma. Mr. Howell had taught me to shoot my .22 when I was young. Now, I went into the Army, and when World War I came, I volunteered, and I was made a captain because I could shoot, and they sent me to France, where I spent 19 months. If I had not married Bessie Rowland, another reporter, whom I married in 1914, she fussed at me enough so that I wouldn't stay in the Army. Otherwise, I would have made a career out of the military. But I couldn't because of Bessie's insistence that I get home and get on with my writing. Well, I succeeded at journalism better than I did at other writing. And I finally got to be the assistant editor of the Evening Journal, but I was writing only pulp fiction and getting paid by the word. And so I produced thousands and thousands of words. When they pay you by the word, you learn to express yourself in a lot of different ways. And by 1917, I was in New York, and I and some other friends founded the New Yorker magazine. And we were writing articles for that magazine. And when I came back, when I was trying to develop this writing style, I recognized that most of the books that I read of a historical quality were dry as dust. The history, which is what I wanted to study, which is what I have always studied, which is what I find most exciting, was written by egg-headed intellectuals that don't know how to write. I asked myself, why can't we have historical accuracy with literary quality? And this was what I set about myself to do. I first wrote a book on the American Legion. Well, that was kind of a dry one because that is a dry subject. But when I was sent down to cover the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1924, I figured I'd while away a few hours in the library, and I went in there and I started reading about Sam Houston. Now, I had heard about old Sam because I knew his son, Temple Houston. I met Temple here in Enid, and I can still see him to this day. Long, blonde hair, high heel cowboy boots, pearl-handled pistols. It seemed that, well, he was here in Enid because he apparently committed some outrage down in Texas, and the judge, apparently wanting to do Sam Houston a favor, said he could either go to jail or go up to Indian Territory. I guess in Texas, coming to Indian Territory was about the same thing as going to jail. Well, old Temple was up here, and so I wanted to find out a little bit more about old Sam. So I started reading all about him, and I got excited about writing a biography and about Sam Houston. And by the way, I consider myself a biographer and not a historian. I consider myself not a novelist, but a biographer. Biography is by far the most difficult thing to write because you have to look at the little things, and you also have to keep the character as the center. The background is simply background, but you've got to keep the character always in focus. This kind of thing is terribly difficult to write because you have to look at their day-to-day activities, see what they did, how they did it, what kind of enjoyment they took, and what foods they ate, all of these little things that historians don't have to deal with. Well, I thought the book on Sam Houston was going to take me about 6 months. I gave it about 6 months. Well, 4 years later, I finally completed it. And I sent it off to New York, and the initial editor that I sent it to there at Bob's Merrill said, I don't know anybody wants to read something about Sam Houston. He didn't know who he was. He pronounced his name Houston. So he said, let me give it to this other editor. He's kind of a sucker for that Western stuff. And so I began, so it was accepted and was sent off. And of course, as you know, I did receive the Pulitzer Prize for that. Oscar Wilde said that any fool could make history, but it took a genius to write about it. Well, you know Oscar, and I would agree with you that what he said had a gram of sense to it, but once I had to take Oscar's point of view to a friend who was putting in a plug for a novelist and for an academic position. And I decided to go east and to ask me, they asked me to come east, the esteemed university. And I went in and talked to those individuals. And then we were getting on well, and they knew of my work, and they appreciated my writing. And they said they were about to offer me a job teaching. And then they said, where are your degrees from? I said, I don't have any degrees. Well, that shocked them. They said, that's it. You are not then worthy to teach at this institution. Now, what are you going to do with people like that? How are you going to handle those kind of individuals who know what you've done, but because you don't have a couple of letters after your name, they don't consider you worthy of teaching? Well, that was my foray into the academic area. One of the other characteristics, instead of not only learning about the person, is people want to know where do I find my material? Well, I'm very much in favor of and excited about what we call primary source documents. These are diaries. These are newspaper accounts. These are letters. These are things that people themselves have written at the time. And I have a real predilection for them. I always look to that because I want to be historically accurate, but yet entertaining at the same time. I want to write accurate history, but make it readable so that others want to read about the history. For example, when I was doing the biography of Andrew Jackson, I went to New Orleans, and I looked over the area where the Battle of New Orleans took place. And I looked at the geography, I looked at the topography, and it helped me to visualize the actual story that I was going to tell in the Andrew Jackson saga. I have to say, by the way, that Bessie has been a great help to me. My wife Bessie has been a great help to me, and I'm a little chagrined that she wrote children's books about my books. And in fact, her book entitled 6'6", about, she's not here today, so I can tell you this. Her book, 6'6", is actually doing better than my book. It was a kind of a, but she has always been a big help to me in that area and a good confidant. My daughter, Cynthia, who is now attending a Quaker school in Philadelphia, and again, much to my chagrin, is able to beat me now at tennis most of the time. In fact, if you see me limping, it's because I sprained my ankle playing tennis with her a few days ago, and I haven't gotten over that yet. Well, my daughter Cynthia asked me one day, she said, "Dad, why don't you actually write about something you know about?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You know, those stories you're always telling us about growing up down there in Enid on the Strip." And I thought, well, that's a novel idea. So every now and then I would write a story about, I would remember something that happened at Wampy Washburn's Pool Hall, or from the Cogdale McKee building, or the school adventures that I have, and I would write them down. I really had it almost done by 1934, but it wasn't quite ready to publish yet. But I can assure you that it is coming out soon, and it's going to be called The Cherokee Strip: Memoirs of a Boy Who Grew Up Here in Oklahoma.
His boyhood journal was written around the time that he was 13 years old, so it was written about 1904. And it's, as you can imagine, it's very brittle, it's very fragile, but it's just really interesting to look at and see life as a 13-year-old in 1904 in Enid, Oklahoma, what was going on in his world, how life was just completely different then, and how he was handling things and that he was handling. And there's artwork in there. It's just a really interesting look at the difference, the way that he lived his life rather than the way that we live ours. It's just a really cool thing. We plan to use the room primarily as a quiet study room. It is originally meant to be the local history room. It houses our local history collection. It houses books that were written by authors who either lived in the area, either in Enid or in the 5 surrounding counties, or books that were written about Enid or the 5 surrounding counties. Over the years, the collection has grown, and so our job now is to weed the collection back down to what it was originally intended to be. And that has become a bit of a challenge because the collection has grown very large. And so that is a continuing process for us in the library. And so it will house a local collection, both by authors and where the books actually are about. But it will also house artifacts for Marquis James himself. It houses our personal Marquis James collection, items that were either donated by the Cromwell family or by the Marquis James family. A portrait that was donated by descendants of Marquis James and by Marquis James himself shortly before and shortly after he died.
On multiple occasions, I've had the opportunity to conduct research of Marquis's personal papers and correspondence, a total of 48 boxes, housed at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Not only was he a professional writer, but he was a voluminous correspondent. Experiencing the collection, one becomes deeply impressed by the breadth and size of his creative writing output. And then, more to realize, he accomplished all of it using manual typewriters with inked ribbons long before the days of electronic typewriters or Microsoft Word's life and God-saving cut and paste and undo options. How he would have loved those. His correspondence over decades show he knew a tremendous number of people, yet he was a private man and a generous and loyal friend. He lost touch with some of those he knew in Enid, but he always inquired after them.
But Dad always marveled most at Marquis' storytelling ability. No one else he knew could make the normal events more interesting than Mark. For extra money, Marquis wrote stories for the pulp Wild Western fiction magazines, which Paul Vickery's told us a little bit about, and my father somehow knew quite a bit about that, and I think he had started that perhaps while he was still at the News Eagle. I'm not positive of that, but I think he had, because Dad knew quite a bit about it. And he said it was the greatest money-making scheme he'd ever seen, because Marquis would sit down at the typewriter, put a sheet of paper into it, roll it up, and start typing with 2 fingers. And he would type steadily until the story was finished. And he typed the sheet of paper, it went out in the stack, the next sheet went in, it went out in the stack. No rereading, no editing, no changes. When he'd finished the story, you folded the paper, you put it in the envelope, and you mailed it to the magazine. And often, Marquis would make for one story at a cent a word what my father was making in a month working for the newspaper, I think. So he was very impressed with that. And he said Marquis had this amazing skill. His stories simply flowed from his mind onto the page. Dad always thought that was a great deal.
Enid instilled in him a wanderlust. His interaction with the tramp printers instilled in him a desire to learn how to hitchhike on trains and see the world. While he practiced on stationary trains in the train yard, he dreamed of going other places. He physically left Enid in 1911, but he never left his Enid heritage. I've often thought it's no accident that the 2 biographies for which he won the Pulitzer Prizes, Sam Houston and Andrew Jackson, were biographies of childhood heroes, visions of whom he had growing up here.
We had about 140 people show up for the event. We had members of the Marquis James family here. We had members of the Cromwell family here. We had library board members here. We had members of the press here. It was just a really well attended event, and I was really pleased with how well it came off. We got nothing but compliments. It felt like the perfect way to open the room, to say, thank you, Marquis James, for being part of Enid. It felt wonderful.
Our family members, now about 45 in number, are far-flung and live in 10 states. So from all of us to all of you, we thank you truly for honoring Marquis James and keeping his flame alive for the past 60 years. Thank you for remembering him and for your steadfast and enduring loyalty to and honor of him.